All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Millennials Are Old podcast. And you know what, Brian? I've been thinking, right? I've been a vegetarian for about 5 years now. And, I'm very intense about it. I'm obviously very preachy about it. So I'm deciding I'm going to stop being a vegetarian. I'm going to become a vegan. Of course, as we all know, they're always chill. They're not preachy about it at all. So I think this will be an easy transition for me.
Well, I am also in the midst of a transition. So listeners might not know. In fact, Taylor, you might not know. Usually, while we record these episodes, I am jacking off. I jack off throughout the record, and then I climax just as we finish the conversation. So that's basically what you're listening to every week on the show. But today I decided no. For the next hour or so, I will not jack off for the first time. And I'm doing this for myself. I'm doing this for you guys.
Well, you know
But
what,
I think it'll
Brian?
be worth it.
Speaking of preachy vegans and jack off sessions, that just goes right into our review for this week, which is the Firestorm EP by the band Earth Crisis. But before we get into our review, Brian, let's bring back our segment, Cringe Generational Moment of the Week.
Week.
Woo! Yeah! All right. So, of course, we had a little bit of an intro here where we described, of course, very preachy vegans. We described Earth Crisis. So my cringe generational moment of the week is specifically about an ALF, or Animal Liberation Front activist by the name of Peter Young. Now, Animal Liberation Front is not a millennial thing at all. It's a very specific Gen X thing.
It's very Gen X, yes.
Very, very Gen X. And even though, of course, there's obviously vegans and vegetarians and animal liberation people in the millennial generation, they're far
But they
less.
post.
Yeah, they post. They don't do. Not that
Yeah.
this is necessarily useful, but they don't do. You know what I mean? They post.
Yeah, no, the ALF millennials are posting right now.
But this individual by the name of Peter Young, who, by the way, is directly involved with Earth Crisis. So that's why I wanted to choose this individual. And he also has a Wisconsin connection. So it's kind of perfect for this episode that we talked about.
God, imagine being a vegan from Wisconsin. I mean, I know you are, but I just can't imagine. It just seems so, maybe not as much now, but I feel like when we were kids, that must have been like hellish to deal with people being so obnoxious.
Well, to be fair, he's actually from Washington State, but he came to Wisconsin to do vegan terrorism.
Fair. I guess if you're going to go to a state to like fight the red meat industrial complex or like factory farms, Wisconsin's one to do it in.
Yeah. Well, actually, we're going to get into that once we get to the location of where this happened, because I got some shit to talk about it. But anyways, this is Peter Young. He is an American animal rights activist. He was indicted by a federal grand jury in 1998 on charges related to fur farm raids in Iowa, South Dakota, and Wisconsin. He was in hiding for 7 years before being arrested in San Jose and sentenced to 2 years imprisonment in 2005. So there's a bit of a bio. I'm not going to get into it. He basically saw some fucked up shit and became a vegan because of that. But the sentence I want to read here is, Young describes himself as being strongly influenced by mid-1990s vegan straight edge bands such as Vegan Reich, Earth Crisis, and Raid. He says, quote, "The vegan straight edge scene is directly responsible for the course of my life," unquote.
I mean, my life has been guided by much, much more toxic punk bands, so I can't judge too harshly.
That's a good point. So I'm going to get into a little bit of his antics here. So in the fall of 1997, Young and a friend, Justin Samuel, set off from Washington with the plan to release animals from fur farms in the Midwest on their way to Florida. A 2-week period in October saw the release of at least 8,000 minks and fox from 6 fur farms in Iowa, South Dakota, and Wisconsin, along with the destruction of the breeding records at each farm. On October 28, 1997, police officers pulled over Young and Samuel in Sheboygan County, Wisconsin, after officers received a call from fur farmers who suspected that the two were surveying farms. Their vehicle was impounded and a search warrant application was granted the following day. The search of their vehicle yielded animal rights literature, fur farm addresses, and other suspicious items. Now, I want to mention the fact that he got pulled over in fucking Sheboygan specifically. So, you're talking about factory farms and just animal products in general. In Sheboygan County, the town of Plymouth, which is right next to Sheboygan, produces, no bullshit, 20% of America's cheese. 20% of America's cheese in that one fucking town alone.
That's like what people that aren't from Wisconsin would say is a joke.
Isn't that crazy to think about, though? 20%?
Yeah, 20% of the world of the nation's cheese is not made in Wisconsin. It's made in one town in Wisconsin.
Yeah, in a town of like maybe 20,000 people. Oh, I'm sorry. It has 9,000 people. That rocks.
Literally more cheese by weight in that town at any given time than humans.
Yeah. So yeah, needless to say, it's very interesting he got caught in Sheboygan specifically. Like the fucking local pigs had their fucking spidey sense, like someone's trying to sabotage our cheese operation.
Yeah, for no shit. Like they heard someone was fucking with farms and they were like, oh my God.
And also another interesting Sheboygan County connection. So the actual city of Sheboygan has 3 different sausage factories, including Johnsonville, which I think is the largest like fucking sausage company in America. So it's a very meat and cheese centric fucking county in the state that's already full of meat and cheese.
Yeah, I mean, if any of our listeners don't know, that is why the Packers are the Packers. People sometimes think I'm joking. People who aren't from Wisconsin think I'm joking when I tell them that, but it is because of like meat packing.
It is 100% true. So yeah, definitely very funny. He got pulled over in Sheboygan specifically. And then some of his other antics. So in September 1998, a federal grand jury indicted Young and Samuel each on 4 counts of extortion by interfering with interstate commerce and 2 charges of animal enterprise terrorism, which, by the way, that is a federal crime, mostly because of meat lobbyists. Like,
of course.
That's the big reason for that.
The fact that you can call that, I mean, I guess technically, yeah, like that is a terroristic act, but it's like, come the fuck on. Like, terrorizing who? Like, meat lobbyists, literally.
Yeah. Young remained wanted by the FBI for over 7 years. Samuel was arrested on September 4th, 1999 in Belgium and was extradited to the United States to face trial. He agreed to cooperate with the government in exchange for a reduced sentence of 2 years. And this is so fucking funny, and this is so Gen X. I fucking love this. So Young was arrested in San Jose, California on March 21st, 2005 on charges of shoplifting CDs from a local Starbucks and was extradited to Wisconsin.
In 2005?
Dude was on the run for 7 years, and he literally was like, "Oh man, I gotta listen to that fucking Belinda Carlisle CD
this is
Starbucks."
This is a guy that listens to Earth Crisis and Raid. What was at the Starbucks that he needed?
Listen, Brian, that new Michelle Branch CD was a banger. All right, he needed to shoplift though.
The Joni Mitchell album that she came out of retirement to. Well, what was he gonna resell it? Was he flipping them? I don't. Also, 2005 was any. I mean, I was buying CDs in 2005, but I don't think like you needed to. I wasn't stealing them. I didn't need them that bad.
Yeah, Jesus fucking Christ. In August 2005, prosecutors were forced to drop the extortion charges against Young because a Supreme Court ruling had changed the definition of extortion. In September 2005, Young pleaded guilty to conspiracy to release mink from 6 fur farms, once again in South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Iowa, and the actual release of 2,400 mink from a farm in Medford, Wisconsin. Prosecutors argued that Young had acted on behalf of the ALF, but Young's attorneys denied this. Young was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison, 360 hours of community service at a charity to benefit humans and other species. That was the charity he was supposed to do. I don't know exactly what that fucking means, but okay. And also $254,000 in restitution and 1 year probation. He was released in 2007, and he said before being sentenced, he told the court, addressing fur farmers, that he would forever mark those nights on your property as the most rewarding experience of my life. So, I mean, hey, he enjoyed it. Yeah, based as fuck. And then also, there's a specific part of this wiki article that I want to highlight because, like, oh, here we go. Since his release, Young has been giving speeches, selling merchandise in Earth Crisis' reunion tutor, and helping to release a vegan straight edge hip hop compilation.
I bet that sucks.
Yeah, I bet that's fucking garbage.
I mean, I don't know. Like, I should listen to it because, like, it's 2024. All sorts of different people make all kinds of music. You know, barriers to entry aren't what they once were. But there's no fucking way that's good, right? Hang on, my mind is. The wheels in my head are turning now. Dead Prez have songs about not doing drugs and having promiscuous sex and being a vegan. Like, there is a strand of that in political black hip hop.
I mean, to be fair, though, Brian, by percentage of population, black people are the most common vegans. So there is something to be said for that.
Yeah, that's what I'm kind of like that. There is like an element of hip hop. So maybe it's not like a bunch of, maybe it's not like a bunch of like hardcore guys. I don't know, maybe.
It's certainly fucking possible. I mean, fuck. And then also, Young has done numerous speaking engagements and continues to be involved in the animal rights movement. He has been featured as a speaker at animal rights conferences held in the United States and has spoken at animal rights conferences in Europe. Young also serves as an advisor for the North American Animal Liberation Press Office. So needless to say, he's still very much involved in the culture.
All right. Like, that's not like a cause that I'm very knowledgeable on, or I don't spend a lot of time thinking about, but I don't have a lot bad to say about this guy. That's not what I would have done, I guess. But
Yeah, no, I mean, it's one of those things where obviously that kind of like stochastic quote unquote terrorism, as the fucking government decided to word it, isn't all that useful, but I can't hate on the guy. He was doing what he fucking believed in, and he didn't really hurt anybody either. Let's be
yeah, he
honest
didn't
here.
hurt anybody. It kind of does seem like maybe eventually being caught in Belgium and extradited was ultimately better for his life because then he does his time or whatever, which you said it was what, 2 years?
Yeah, about 2 years, but he also owed
So, but
$254,000 in restitution. So that's
okay, hear me. Yeah, that's a lot of money probably for this guy. I'm sure he's not loaded, but like he's now able to just live his life, right? Like
Mhm.
he doesn't have to be like on the run or whatever, and he can just fucking be like a celebrity in like the animal rights world.
Oh no, I bet you if you were to go to like some like fucking vegan cafe somewhere in like the Twin Cities or Portland,
Yeah,
he would be treated as a god.
people would know yeah, he would be a name on the scene, a lot of one of the things, and obviously where we grew up, you see a lot of this, but you saw a lot of it everywhere, probably until very recently, and maybe even still. Animal rights stuff is easy to dunk on because, as we've alluded to, they can be really preachy, and like anyone, the people that are loudest are people that everyone thinks of. But really, I mean, like you said, I don't think this guy wasn't going to bring about the end of like factory farming or anything. And I'm going to say, I'm sure some of those animals that he freed, some of them were probably found and sent right back. Like there wasn't any lasting kind of like mark of change from this. But as cringe millennials go, not the worst.
Oh no, definitely not. Like when it comes to our cringe fucking generational like criminals, he's on the very low end of that for us.
Like this guy probably, I'm sure if we looked at his notebooks, he's written some pretty bad poetry.
Oh god, yes.
He maybe even thought about being a singer in a band, and at one point, he maybe has some shitty tattoos. But beyond that,
Yeah, no,
what's
exactly. But
I
you
don't
know,
know. I'm curious what he thought the end result. Like, was his goal literally just to save as many animals as he could from this, or did he want to have some sort of chain reaction as a statement?
I think it was one of those things where he probably did it initially as like, well, kind of like a propaganda of the deed thing. I think that's kind of
Right.
what he's going for, but I think history has proven that propaganda of the deed is always a fucking miserable failure. It literally never works. Because like propaganda of the deed, so to the audience at home that don't know, propaganda of the deed is an anarchist term that's often misattributed to solely like political assassinations. That's not necessarily what it's about, but it's the idea of individual action. Essentially, if it's done like publicized enough and on a mass scale, it will get the populace like out of their chains and go fight the power or whatever. And truth be told, all it does is it villainizes whatever movement that the person who did this stochastic terrorism does. And there's like a massive like state fucking smackdown on basically whatever they're advocating for. That's all it ends up doing.
And something like the animal rights movement is already so maligned. And when it's not maligned, it's by default mocked in the US that's not how you're going to bring about that change, just because it's never going to have any chance to build momentum that way. I don't have a better solution either, I guess. But I guess what I'm kind of wondering is if his goal was just to save as many animals as he could in that moment, then I guess you could kind of in that way call him a success.
Yeah, if he was willing to
But
be like a martyr for the cause, then he kind of did, like.
yeah,
But Brian, we were talking about having an organized political movement about veganism and animal rights. That just leads right into our fucking review here. So once again, we're talking about Firestorm EP by the band Earth Crisis. It came out in 1993. It does not have a parental advisory sticker. It was performed by the band Earth Crisis once again. The personnel includes Carl Buchner on vocals, and I think he's like the only consistent member, if I'm not mistaken, at this point. It also features
probably.
Benjamin Reed and Scott Krause on guitar. And this is the first trivia fact I have here, and this was so fucking funny to me. So both Ben and Scott were around 15 years old when this EP was recorded, and they dropped out of high school to go fucking tour and record for it. Carl Buchner, when this was recorded, was 23 years old.
That's very hardcore, guy.
Yeah, Jesus Christ, right?
That's a pop punk thing. Sorry.
Yeah, it really is a pop punk thing. and,
Truly.
and also Dennis Merrick on drums. And there also was supposed to be a bassist on this album, but bassist Ian Edwards could not travel because he was attending his senior year of high school. So he aged up a little bit. He at least had an 18-year-old on this fucking band.
An 18-year-old who was more focused on graduating than The band.
The band recruited a temporary bassist with the requirement that he has to be vegan straight edge. But after realizing that the player was not very good, Krause and Reed recorded the instruments separately.
Yeah, don't you wish you'd just done that the first time?
Yeah, right. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. And, speaking of other things that are very bad, this was released on Victory Records. Rest in peace, Victory Records. I'm sorry, rest in piss, Victory Records. Those guys fucking suck shit.
Terrible guys, and let's just say mixed results with their roster. Some pretty great records on there, and some other ones.
Yeah, some absolute bangers, but holy fuck were those guys scumbags who ran fucking Victory Records. Holy shit.
A hardcore label, one of the first committed hardcore labels, was run by some shitheads. That's crazy.
Brian, are you telling me that some of the first hardcore, fucking bands were full of assholes? Are you telling me Greg Ginn was a piece of shit, Brian?
Boy, isn't it weird? This whole genre that's based on just being confrontational and just angry and outwardly violent towards everyone around you for no real discernible reason is a little antisocial.
I'm very shocked by that, to be honest with you, Brian. And then once again, this EP, it was produced by the band and Bill Korecki at his, I believe, Ohio home. And the EP is 15 minutes and 16 seconds long. This is by far the shortest thing we've ever reviewed. It's literally only 3 tracks. Well, technically the first one's a split. So it's 4 songs on this EP, 15 minutes and 16 seconds long. Although, to be fair, a pretty good length for a hardcore EP, I will say.
I mean, I was going to say, there are long hardcore albums and they're great. But really, if you're in a hardcore band, you should be able to... You can put out a longer album and it can be really good. But you should be able to put out a 15-minute album. That can be great, too. That's part of making hardcore, I think.
Absolutely. And, speaking of great, so on Amazon, it has a 4.9 out of 5, and on Rate Your Music, it is a 3.7 out of 5. In fact, on Rate Your Music, it is the 14th highest ranked metal album of 1993. So clearly people on Rate Your Music like this thing a lot. And I usually get into the Amazon reviews on our albums first, but to be honest with you, the Amazon reviews spoil a lot of the things that I want to talk about when it comes to this EP, so needless to say, I'll save that one till the end this time. And also, the Amazon reviews section was the easiest I've ever done because there were literally only 10 written reviews for this whole album on Amazon. This was a very easy one to whittle down to a couple.
I bet there were some good ones, though.
To be honest, not a whole lot of cringe ones. There were genuinely people who had very thoughtful and actually intelligent things to say for once. I was very shocked.
Well, because the type of guy that likes talking about Earth Crisis is has those hardcore guys. They think about their dumb albums a lot.
Yeah. Speaking of people who are going to discuss this album, let's just get right into the track listing. So the first track, and this is the only split on the album, is Firestorm and Forged in the Flames. Now, the actual track of Firestorm is, I would argue, probably Earth Crisis's most well-known song.
It is, easily.
Very influential to future metalcore, and including, well, actually I'll save that one for later, but let's just say it's very influential to modern day metalcore, at least what metalcore would become. I think that's without saying. There's some metalcore ass shit on this whole song, holy fuck.
Well, so this album, you would never now in 2024, now that metalcore's been a defined genre for song, you would never call Firestorm by Earth Crisis metalcore.
That's fair.
At the time, it was. And that's kind of one of the things I thought about listening to this is when you talk, so I listen to a lot of hardcore. Throughout all spectrums, it's one of my favorite genres. A thing happens in the 90s where now hardcore's been a genre for over 10 years, going on 15 years by the time this album comes out in 92. Is that right?
93.
93. Yeah, going on 15 years. And what happens in the 90s is hardcore has begun to kind of morph into a thing that's sort of distinct from what it was. So you have hardcore punk, which is like punk, but it's more underground and it's more extreme and it's happening all across the US. By the 90s, there's a thing that is hardcore that's almost not punk anymore. Right? It's something separate and it's folded more metal influence up into it. And it's not snotty in the same way. It's kind of disciplined and very serious. And I kind of think that's where Earth Crisis fall in.
Oh, yes. They are very serious. They're very militant. This is a band when, they discuss their lyrics and they call it Earth Crisis. They're very literal about that. This is a band about the degradation of the environment, human rights abuses, animal torture. Carl Buchner was specifically inspired by the Black Panthers and stuff like that. This is very serious political music to them, straight up.
And the thing that's interesting about that sonically is that's reflected in their sound. So there were, in some way or another, militant hardcore punk bands, right? But throughout the 80s, a lot of them still sound pretty rock and roll-ish, even when you get to like Minor Threat or SSD. And I would say SSD probably a big influence on Earth Crisis early on. But here, even the songwriting is very militant sounding. Like it sounds tight and it sounds kind of strict. It's not very technical, but it's not loose sounding at all. It's like the militancy is reflected in, I think, how tight and how kind of oppressive sounding the melodies are.
Well, especially a band that 3/4 of them are literal high schoolers. This sounds tight as shit. And
And it's
speaking
crazy
of,
to me that they produced this themselves too. That's wild.
yeah, right. Speaking of the actual militant lyrics, I want to get into some of the lyrics specifically, and we'll get into the lyrics of all of them because there's only 4 songs in the whole fucking album. So
Yeah.
there's a lot to talk about here. But on Firestorm, the lyrics start off like this: street by street, block by block, taking it all back. The youth immersed in poison, turn the tide, counterattack, violence against violence. Let the roundups begin. A firestorm to purify the bane that society drowns in. So needless to say, this is a song I think about coming all together and just loving each other. But no, in all seriousness, this is a song about fucking Earth Crisis, rounding up drug dealers and murdering them. Like, that's what this fucking song is about. Like, holy shit.
Yeah. This is one of the earlier examples of a trend that became dominant in hardcore throughout the 90s and into the 2000s. This is like the very beginning of hardcore lyrics still being very literal, which they were throughout the 80s too, but becoming a little more verbose and kind of having sort of literary aspirations. So Firestorm or Earth Crisis don't go as far in that direction as some later bands like Shy Halode or whoever who get kind of goofy with it. But it is like there's this sense of seriousness that we are writing here. There's sort of like attempts at imagistic writing and things that I think worked very well for this album, but it is sort of the birth of a trend in hardcore that is not my favorite lyrical approach. I think Earth Crisis do it well and it fits them well, but I also think it inspired a lot of bands to have very annoying, pretentious hardcore lyrics.
Well, Brian, even though this is a New York State hardcore band, I wouldn't describe this as New York hardcore. But Brian, I think you and I would both agree that New York hardcore guys are always very smart and always make great lyrics. So I don't know what you're talking about.
Well, hardcore in general is known for, it's not known for having like, 5th grade level lyrics or whatever.
Yeah. Well, speaking of things like that, but there is actually one line in here that I think I told you that this is like the hardcore straight edge version of like fucking, what was that, North of Richmond or whatever that song is fucking called.
Yeah, Richmond, North of Richmond.
And the line is a chemically tainted welfare generation.
Yeah, I was just reading that. Great.
Absolute moral degeneration. Oh my God. Like when people said this was fascist, like I can understand why they think this is fascist.
Well, hang on. To those people's credits, and I like this album, and I spent a lot of my time around punk.
And I love this album too. I want that to be very clear.
Yeah, but I feel like now is probably, with these lyrics, it's a good time to get into like what hardline as a subculture is. Because Earth Crisis, one of the defining hardline bands. So hardline, for anyone listening, is an evolution of straight edge. So straight edge, obviously, it evolved. It's this thing starting in punk. It's, we don't drink, we don't drugs, and probably we don't have promiscuous sex, but I feel like that's a little, it's in that Minor Threat song, but most of the straight edge bands, I think, had girlfriends and stuff. It's mostly the drugs and drinking thing. Filters from DC onto Boston and gets a little more aggro and a little bit more of a gang mentality. Get a little bit more of like a bullying us against them thing, and that carries over to New York. Hardline kind of develops in the mid 80s and adds like militant veganism and extreme sex negativity to the mix. That is like a part of hardline, and that is a part of Earth Crisis to less of a degree than some other bands. Like when you get to Earth Crisis, Raid, Vegan Reich, these are bands that militantly vegan, militantly animal rights. They basically, a lot of hardliners believe that sex shouldn't be fun. They basically have a very conservative, weirdly Puritan idea of sex, that it's a natural function. You shouldn't be having sex without the intention to procreate, because that's giving into some baser impulse, even though they're not Christian, like hardliners, right? This isn't a Christian thing. It's very weird. So by extension, a although they would say that they're not homophobic, they basically are. They don't believe that there's any reason to have homosexual sex, right?
Also anti-choice too. A lot of them are very
Yes.
anti-choice.
Yeah, they're very anti-choice. It's a weird subculture. I don't know enough about Earth Crisis, and they don't really write about those things to speak to how they felt individually, but that is the culture that they helped spearhead.
I did read their Wikipedia article, and apparently, at least on the wiki article, it said that they are not homophobic and they're not like anti-choice either.
Thank fucking God.
Yeah, Jesus Christ.
Because some other bands in the scene were.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, we're gonna get to those bands eventually on a future episode, but oh boy, I was very happy to hear that because I'm like, all right, there's already some pretty problematic lyrics in this song, but like, thank God they're not actually like that. Like,
yeah, well, the most offensive lyric, right, is the fucking the welfare generation thing. And when you really break that lyric down, it's like, well, what is that even supposed to mean? Like the lyrics to most of these songs are very like literal, but that to me is kind of like, is he literally talking about welfare, or is he just doing like a word salad thing? I know it's about, I guess you can draw the correlation between, the drug dealer thing and that, but to me that almost just seems like a word vomit thing.
no, it almost makes it sound like they took the DIY maybe a little too literally. Like, if you're not doing it by yourself, you should just die on the street. Although I don't think most hardcore fans believe that specifically.
No, I think most of them got food stamps. There's whole songs about it.
All right, and then we were talking about Forged in the Flames, which is the other split. So the lyrics for that one are Forged in the flames of chaos, hammered by trials to temperate steel, convictions tried and tested onto a razor's edge that's true and real. Wrought between the hammer and the anvil, strengthened to never break, the weakness that surrounds is the evil that I forsake. Never have I taken in the vein the sacred vessel of my soul. I am the master of my fate, my destiny I control. Nobility lies in actions, corrections where once was wrong, ascension from evil with a heart that's true and strong. Through this veil of shadows, the light of truth is my only guide. A knight unyielding, to the X I'm crucified. Now, I know X is specifically the straight edge thing on the hands. I know that. Yeah. Although I will say for like hardcore poetry, this is not bad.
This is not bad for hardcore poetry, but this is not a lyrical style that I enjoy.
That's totally fair.
The Firestorm section of the song, that first half of the song, I actually think is fine, even though it's got like some problematic or whatever lyrics. This section, when I actually read these lyrics here, I kind of just think, oh, come on. Not even because of like the self-righteousness of it, because you just take that as a given when you're going to listen to a straight edge band. That's just part, I don't give a shit about that, but it's just the prose is so purple and you're just like, all right. Never have I taken in vain the sacred vessel of my soul. Okay. Like,
would it make you feel any better, Brian, that originally Carl Buchner went to college to be a history teacher?
I mean, he should have written about history. That would have been cooler.
Yeah. Although, interestingly enough, and we're obviously going to finish out the last two tracks eventually after this obvious segment here, but, Carl Buchner was like a presence on like fucking news TV in the 90s. Like, he was on Fox News, he was on CNN and MSNBC as like a fucking not a correspondent. What's the word I'm looking for here? Like, somebody who just shows up and talks about whatever like new thing is going on. A pundit, maybe even like a hardcore
pundit would be,
And like, have you seen any of his like Fox News interviews?
No.
They're awesome. He does a really good job, I will say that for the most part. He does a pretty fucking good job. I think he went on like Bill O'Reilly and stuff like that too. Like, he went on the shows.
So even though I'm making fun of these lyrics, I want to be clear. Lyrics in hardcore are not that they're unimportant, but like, I'm not sitting here saying it's important to have like these really great smart lyrics, because that's not necessarily what works in hardcore. I do think these lyrics work when I'm listening to the, and that's another thing I think when I talk about the kind of lyrics getting a little bit more, having these literary aspirations. That's another thing that I almost feel is kind of inherited from like metal influence in this generation of hardcore. When I listen to the song, they're fine. When I read it, I'm reading it right now, and I'm like, oh. But in the context of listening to a hardcore song, I think it's fine.
No, absolutely, 100%. And, speaking of, I think that goes right into our next song title, which this is Unseen Holocaust. Now, this one, I think, is very specifically about, like, fucking factory farming. Using the concept of, like, actual Holocaust as a metaphor for animal, Holocaust, which, a lot of vegans do use, which I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's obviously
uncool.
Very uncool. obviously, I think that the mass slaughtering of animals for factory farming is a tragedy upon itself, but it's not the Holocaust. I think that needs to be very clear. In fact, and I know this is, trust me, you can call me out on this, but truth is, if you love the idea of animals existing, factory farms are actually great for that because, like, factory farms produce a lot of animals on top of killing them, on top of it. Like, something like there's like 50,000, I don't know, like Vietnamese waterfowl who are like a progenitor of chicken, but there's like a billion chickens out there. And it's like, I wonder why there's a billion chicken out there. Maybe because we fucking kill and eat them. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, but like the idea of, using an actual Holocaust metaphor to describe factory farming, not a big fan, but I think you can describe it as an environmental catastrophe. That's absolutely like a thing you could fucking say.
That's a pretty standard. I don't want to make an easy hit on like animal rights activists, but that's a thing that I don't like, that I've heard from a lot of animal rights punk bands. The other analogy you hear that to me is in similar waters is like calling like the milking of cows rape or whatever. I don't like that. And it's not, again, like obviously factory farming is this heinous thing. Like it's disgusting. It's basically, it is like an affront to nature. It's kind of an affront to our humanity. And I say this as someone who is not a vegan or vegetarian, but even if you're not, like the process of factory farming, the mass industrialization of like slaughtered animals is, even if you consume animals, like you can make a choice to not consume them that way. It's so basically like should be like morally objectionable to a normal person. But my issue, I guess, with the Holocaust thing, not to harp on it so long, is that like, I mean, obviously they're different things, right?
Yes. They have two completely different motivations. Like, let's be real here.
Yeah, they're happening for different reasons. And I'm sorry, one of them is happening to humans.
Yeah, exactly. Like, nobody started a factory farm and like produced like, fucking meat for capitalism because they're like, I hate chickens. I want them to all die. Like, nobody ever did that.
The guitars on this song are sick. So one of my favorite things about 90s hardcore that you don't get a whole lot of on Firestorm, on the EP, is this kind of noisy, dissonant kind of like squeal. That's a thing that comes out of, I would say, like early post-hardcore, like Fugazi and Rites of Spring. I kind of associate with Guy Picciotto a lot. And that's kind of a prevalent thing in early 90s hardcore. There isn't a lot of that on this album because this album is very chug, like it's very chuggy. The guitars are very percussive. It's a lot of, kind of breakdowns and like near breakdowns. But there is this really cool, I don't know if it's a pinch harmonic or what, kind of like siren sound from the lead guitar on the chorus of Unseen Holocaust. And I swear it's my favorite noise on this whole record.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Also, I do want to mention something, having just read the lyrics a little bit. I think even though this could obviously be an allegory for what a lot of vegans and straight edge people talk about when it comes to factory farming, I do think this one is also more about the actual genocide of Native Americans. So I do want to mention that a little bit because they mention things like manifest destiny, tortured and enslaved in the names of Christianity, demons descended upon the lands. Like there's definitely some of that in here, obviously, too.
I actually, in my notes, I have a line about the Manifest Destiny line, but I didn't actually read the lyrics. So I was like, oh, that was there. And then I put a question mark. But yeah, other than that, I was kind of going through it and I went Manifest Destiny question mark.
Yeah. So having just read the lyrics now, even though, this could have a double entendre, I do want to clarify. I think this song is mostly about specifically the genocide of indigenous and Native Americans. I want to put that out there. But at the same time, though, I did think that segment that we had about the idea of like Holocaust imagery to talk about what vegans talk about when it comes to factory farming is relevant because like Earth Crisis absolutely believe that.
And that's definitely a trend in hardline, but there's also a trend in hardline of like advocacy or attempted advocacy for indigenous people because there's kind of a through line, between that and environmentalism. I kind of think that's the way that hardline bands are looking at it. Not to say that they aren't just purely anti-racist and anti-imperialist, because I think in their own way they are. But there's this weird thing where, like, for a lot of hardline bands, not just Earth Crisis, so I'm not specifically accusing them of this. There's this thing where you're like, oh, we're specifically talking about Native American people in kind of a naturalist way, which I don't know. Maybe it's just because I don't know a lot about environmentalism as a movement, It's not like a strand of leftism or progressivism that I read a lot about or anything. That's always kind of weird to me when like a punk band does that.
I mean, it's one of those things where obviously
I, I'm
neither of
I'm not
us, you know,
I'm
we
not specifically talking about Earth Crisis or this song, to be clear. Like I'm not like accusing them of this. It's just a thing that feels kind of strange to me.
no, totally. And obviously neither of us are native. I mean, our best friend is half native and he kicks politicians. Never mind. We're not going to get into that right now. But, like in general, the idea of, indigenous people and this idea of like they know all about like sustainable agriculture and all these things. That's mostly, I think, noble savage bullshit, to be honest with you. Like, I do think that they have probably a better understanding of it than, let's just say, white hog Americans, obviously.
Because
But like,
well,
when native people, came to this land 25,000 years ago from the Bering Strait or whatever, like they extincted a lot of species. Okay. Like that is a thing that they just did because humans in general are the most destructive species. They just are. And I'm not saying that in a sense of like, oh, that's, monstrous. We need to all become anti-natalist or whatever. But like, that's just the reality. We are conquerors of the land. No matter what we do, no matter how like good of intentions we have of it, humans existing on this planet and having the sort of like fucking lifestyle that humans are accustomed to, we destroy the world. That's just the reality.
and then well, before I guess we move on from this track, I do want to say musically, Unseen Genocide, my favorite track on the album. It has a really anthemic chorus. I actually think this whole album kind of plays like one song. I think I told you that in our messages, Taylor. To me, it feels like an epic song
Yes.
rather than three distinct songs. But this is my favorite segment of the album.
Yeah, I know you were talking about the pinch harmonics. Fucking fantastic. I love that part of this fucking song. It's genuinely like
It
really groovy as fuck.
really stands out because there's not really anything else on Firestorm like this. Like I said, the rest of this album is the guitars are very sturdy sounding, which is cool and it works really well. But it makes those pinch harmonics really stand out for me on that chorus
No,
or
absolutely.
bridge, I guess.
Yeah. And then you were talking about epic. So let's get into the final crescendo of our epic here. This is Eden's demise. I think this is what I was confusing with Unseen Holocaust because this one is, I think, very specifically about veganism and like fucking destruction of nature when it comes to, fucking factory farming and, animal
Well,
annihilation. Like this one very specifically is about that. Whereas Unseen Holocaust, I think, is a little less allegorical. Like that one's like just literally about killing people. Whereas this one is, I would say, even more so than all the other songs. This is a call to arms for veganism. Like the ocean's disease, the stricken land's decay, mankind's supremacist mentality has set this world ablaze. Nature's plan forever altered, animals lost to extinction. This society's based on greed fuels the onslaught of destruction. The circle of death ends with the instigators victimized. The means to quench a selfish lust brings Eden's demise. Mass murder, demonic cruelty, absolute fascism. To end the enslavement and slaughter, the antidote is veganism. Like,
like I'm sorry, that's those lyrics. That's corny to me, man.
yeah.
Like I respect it, okay? I like the album, but I've been kind of tap dancing around it. This is my thing with like the hardline thing, even more than whatever I disagree with about. Well, the sex stuff is weird. They're fucking weird about sex,
Yeah,
right?
yes.
But the thing with these lyrics is just like, and it's first of all, like obviously there's things with any band that's this militant, I probably won't agree with everything they say, but it's also like there's like a distinction between let's look at another like hardcore album from roughly the same era that we covered recently, which was Feel the Darkness by Poison Idea. So that's like very firmly like in the punk camp. They're also an older band, so take that for what it's worth. But so lyrically, that album still has some sort of righteousness and it talks about social themes, but it's very like kind of the way it's pissed off is a lot snottier, right? It's a lot
It's a bit more detached.
detached. Yeah. It's kind of sarcastic and kind of, I don't know. But the thing with straight edge bands, particularly this era of straight edge bands, is that they are giving you like a prescriptive thing of like, this is what's going to save the world. And at this point in my life, I think, and there's all kinds of political bands that I love, but it's also like, that's not really what I connect with at this point in my life when I listen to like a punk song. Like, yeah, and there are still straight edge bands that I can connect. Like, if I listen to like something like Get It Away by SSD, I feel this sense of like panic and kind of like being trapped by this society that doesn't accept you. Or same with like something like Minor Threat. With this, the lyrics they're so literal and they're so prescriptive that it does kind of feel, and you could say this about other types of punk bands too. You could say this about Crash or Jello Biafra even. It's like, well, okay, am I like listening to a song here that's supposed to make me feel an emotion, or am I supposed to be like listening to a seminar right now?
Yeah. And honestly, it's one of those things where like I don't necessarily mind preachy or prescriptive or very literal lyrics as long as I mostly or completely agree with it. That's totally fine. But if I'm listening to like, early 2000s country and it's basically like, well, we're gonna get together and we're gonna kill some Arabs. I'd be like, yeah,
So,
no, I don't want to hear any of this bullshit. But for this,
so,
I'm like, okay, I at least can groove to it. And especially with the instrumentation being really solid here, it works for me. Like,
so I can groove to it 100%. Does not bother me. So lyrics are important to me. It's not that they're not important, but I do sort of see lyrics, even though they're important, and I like when songs are about something and they reflect the band. I do see lyrics in music as basically aesthetic choices to complement the music, which isn't to say that they're meaningless. And so, in that sense, I think that Earth Crisis lyrics on Firestorm are perfect. They are perfectly complementary to this band's music. And that's, again, not to say that they don't matter or that they're not genuine, but that's what I think the actual purpose of rock lyrics are, is to find good topics, good subjects that aesthetically match the vibe that your band is going for. I think these lyrics do that very well throughout. What I will say, I think where you and I differ is like, I also don't mind prescriptive lyrics or very literal lyrics. In fact, a lot of my favorite songs are very much like that. And it's not even necessarily that important to me that I have to agree with them. Although, as you said, if it's like a Screwdriver song or something, obviously it's going to turn me off. But it's almost more like, again, like the purple prose here is, again, it doesn't bother me when I listen to the album because it fits this band and their sound and their vibe so perfectly. But when I'm reading it here, which again, lyrics aren't meant to be read on paper. Lyrics aren't meant to be read on paper. They're not poetry. They're lyrics that are meant to be listened to in a song. They serve a different function. But reading it here on paper, I'm like, these are bad. This is bad writing.
Yeah.
No, it's not bad writing. It's not bad writing because it's meant to be listened to in a song. Sorry, I'm kind of babbling, but this is a thing I think about a lot. That's kind of, I feel like a lot of people will look at a song and go like, oh, these lyrics are good. These lyrics are bad. Well, I mean, that's not really how lyrics work. It's kind of like when people say, well, lyrics are just poetry set to music. No, they're fucking not. Lyrics and poetry, one is not better than the other, but they don't serve the same purpose. As straight edge, hardline, hardcore punk lyrics, these are great. But they are dumb.
Yeah.
And it's not about whether I agree with them or not. I agree with a lot of what they say in specifics on this album. I'm not a vegan. I'm not straight edge. Obviously, I think anyone that knows me knows that. But it's the way that it's, I guess, the verbosity of them makes me kind of think like, all right, man. And then I think like, oh yeah, two of these guys were 15 when they made this.
Yeah.
Checks out.
And also the very last paragraph here of the lyrics of this whole EP. So, a peaceful world can evolve after animal liberation. To persist with what is immoral is illogical. There is no excuse for violence against nature or for the innocent to be killed. I see so much sickness. The enemy surrounds. I see so much sickness. I fear what the future holds. I have hope that the point of no return has not yet been passed. These are the final moments. Sand pours from a broken hourglass. And
okay,
that's it.
That's pretty good. So when you get to I see so much sickness, the enemy surrounds, I see so much sickness, that whole bit all the way to sand pours from a broken hourglass, that I think is like actually good. When I hear that on the record and when I read it, I'm like, that's a good hardcore lyric. When I read a peaceful world can evolve after animal liberation, to persist with what is immoral is illogical. When I read that line, I think like, well, that's literally just you telling me without any sort of elegance, without any sort of wit, like what you believe. Like, I'm not impressed by it. I think it's fine for the song, but it's also like, I mean, could you have like whipped it up? Could you give it, something else?
Well, you know what though, Brian? I think you and I can both agree. Just like the Billy Jack movies, there's no politics to it. You just got to enjoy the music. Obviously, there's no politics in this fucking EP.
Well, so I don't want to be a dumb shit here. I'm going to say something that is going to annoy a lot of other people who like this album. I don't think about this album's politics when I listen to it. I absolutely do not give a fuck. Not that I don't care about what they're saying or whatever, but like, that's not how I feel when I listen to this. It's not the same as like when I listen to, I'm going to be a basic bitch here. When I listen to The Clash or when I listen to like Billy Bragg or The Dicks, I am thinking about their politics. When I listen to this, not so much. I'm just thinking about some nasty riffs.
Yeah, no.
Some nasty caveman riffs, to be real.
Yeah. All right. And that is the album track listing here and lyrics, and I had 2 Amazon reviews. Before we get into our final thoughts, I want to get into the Amazon reviews. Now, the first Amazon review is long as shit, and to be honest with you, we covered literally everything that this fucking Amazon review wanted to talk about, so I don't really think it's worth necessarily talking about here, although it's a pretty good Amazon review. If you don't want to listen to this whole fucking album review we just did, listen to that, or fucking read that Amazon review. But I do have one Amazon review that I want to highlight because this one fucking blew my mind. So the one Amazon review I'm going to cover here is from Amazon customer who gives us 5 stars. And the head of the review says, as hard as it gets. Now, I want to be clear, Brian. This review was written in October of 2001, so a barely post 9/11 review. So this is a nearly 25-year-old review. So when they say as hard as it gets, that's for 2001. And even then, I still don't think that's as hard as it gets for 2001. But okay.
I mean, it's not. It's not as hard. It's not. And I like this album, but it's not even as hard as it gets for hardcore. Like it's.
Yeah. No.
I mean, I don't know. These guys are clearly tough guys. They could kick my ass. I don't want to.
Yeah. The body of the review said, this is the most fundamentally important of all the Earth Crisis releases. Everything the band was about. Crunching deathcore sound. And we'll get into the deathcore thing in just a minute. With eco lyrics is available here. Only about 10 minutes long. Once again, all the reviews on here, they said this EP was 10 minutes long. It's 15 minutes.
15.
I don't
It's
know
15,
why the
right?
fuck they say 10 minutes. I found that in all of them. I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about?
That's so weird. No, it's 15. It's 15 minutes.
They couldn't even say it was like, oh, it's 16 and a half minutes. Like some weird number that's close to 15. Like, that's totally wrong. I don't know where the fuck they got 10 minutes, but whatever. And they said, but well worth the money. Thoroughly recommended. Now, I saw the deathcore thing, and I'm like, what the fuck are they talking about? This is not deathcore at all. Because when I think of deathcore, and to be fair, I'm thinking of like MySpace deathcore. I'm thinking of like JFAC and fucking Suicide Silence and, you know, early Bring Me the Horizon. Like, that's what I'm fucking thinking of, right? But I did a little research, and apparently the earliest use of the term deathcore was used to specifically describe Earth Crisis. And I'm like, what the fuck?
That makes sense to me in the context of the same way I said that, like, you would never call this metalcore, like, quote unquote, now, I think. But at the time, it was, well, first of all, this is so crunchy and riff heavy. I'm guessing that that's probably why people were the deathcore thing initially.
Yeah, and actually, so I listened to their second album, Gamora's Season's End, and like a bunch of songs in that album actually do sound like very, very proto-deathcore, which I was genuinely pretty shocked by. Like, I wouldn't, like, nobody would ever describe those songs as deathcore now, obviously, but I heard very specific, like, especially instrumental things where I'm like, oh my God, this could fit into like a fucking like early 2000s, like MySpace deathcore fucking song. Like, it really could. I was shocked by it.
And when you suggested this album, I had not listened to Earth Crisis since high school. This is, you know, if you got listeners can guess, I love hardcore, listen to a lot of it. Like 90s straight edge, kind of metal adjacent, not my favorite, not my preferred type of hardcore punk, but I had to listen to it. I did like it, but I was like, oh, that'll be a good choice because this album, more than the lyrics, this is musically interesting to me because it's so influential to like millennial heavy music. And it's not necessarily the most famous album that influenced that era, but if you look at, of course, we've talked about like Jane Doe in the past, but if you look at like some of the screamo shit, or like you said, if you look at, yeah, like deathcore shit that like I don't really listen to, but like Suicide Silence or whatever, like there is a through line that kind of starts with Earth Crisis. They were, of course, crossover had been a thing for many years. Hardcore had already kind of become a part of hardcore. Like they kind of, they were mixed together by 92, right? There was no going back from that. There's no going back to when hardcore is just the circle jerks doing this sped up punk rock and roll. It had become metal adjacent by 92. But the focus, I think, on kind of mosh riffs, like the real emphasis on that, to me, that's Earth Crisis's real contribution. People will say, you know, I did some reading about Earth Crisis and people talk about their influence. People will talk about their politics, and I'm sure on a personal level that impacted people. But really, like that band's lasting legacy to heavy music is bringing this crunchy riff-based like element to hardcore, because that's all over hardcore in like the early 2000s and in the later 90s. It's all over it.
Yes, holy fucking shit. Is it ever? And I wanted to expound a little bit on the deathcore thing. So apparently, Nick Terry of Terrorizer magazine in the year 1996 publicized, we're probably going to settle on the term deathcore to describe the likes of Earth Crisis. And I'm just like, okay. Once again, we very much proven that nobody thinks of fucking Earth Crisis as deathcore now. But I do think it's really interesting to me that the earliest use of the term deathcore was used to describe Earth Crisis. Because, yeah, I mean, we just mentioned it. Like, obviously, they influenced a lot of, like, yeah, very riff-based and, like, very groove-heavy elements to, like, later early 2000s hardcore and metalcore. But, like, that just blew my mind when I listened to it. And I'm like, what the fuck are they talking about? And then, yeah, I listened to their actual albums. And I'm like, no, actually, I can kind of hear it. I actually can kind of fucking hear it.
I didn't listen to that record, and again, I don't listen to deathcore. That's not like deathcore as we know that genre. That's not a genre I know about or one that I think I would be particularly into. I have not listened to that Earth Crisis album. I have listened to Destroy the Machines, which to me is actually like pretty similar to this. I would say it's a little bit more expansive because it's a full length, but it's pretty much a continuation of the sound on Firestorm. What's interesting is like at the time, right? This seems like an outrageous development for hardcore. It's going all in on this mosh element, this metal element. Definitely, of course, they're, a New York State band, so they're not far away from all the NYHC shit going on. But now, when you listen to Earth Crisis, I don't think anyone would think, oh, this is so metal influenced. People would think of this as like classic hardcore. This is closer genealogically to Minor Threat at this point than it is to Turnstile or whatever is the big band in hardcore now.
Yeah. And Brian, you mentioned that you may not be a big fan of deathcore, which obviously that's, everybody has their personal taste.
I don't know.
I will say though, Brian, deathcore and nu metal have a lot in common. A lot in common. Like, a lot of people don't think that, and also we're going to cover an album that is objectively a nu metal and deathcore album. And in fact, it is the literal first nu metal revival album. We will review that album at some point. But like deathcore and nu metal are basically interchangeable now, I would say. Especially nu metal revival, especially in deathcore, are basically interchangeable.
So listeners, Taylor knows this. I am a late arrival to nu metal because Taylor, when we lived together, begged me to listen to the first core album, and I was like, no, I'm not going to. I listen to punk bands. That shit's corny. I refuse to. And then I listened to it, and I was like, oh, shit, this is pretty good. And then I went through this big thing where I listened to all the classic nu metal bands. But what I'll say is, like, that's also bands from, like, that even though I wasn't listening to them during my childhood, I have a different sort of connection with them than I would to like, because I remember in high school, just the most annoying kids trying to get me to listen to Suicide Silence. Okay. I remember them being like, yeah, I love grindcore. I like Suicide Silence when I was listening to like Agoraphobic Nosebleed and Pig Destroyer, and they'd be like, oh, that's like Suicide Silence. And then they'd play me the fucking worst sounding screamy bullshit I've ever heard in my life.
I will say though, Brian, the one thing about deathcore that's very different from nu metal though is that like it's not really very weird music. It's actually not weird music though. It is actually pretty by the numbers, I would say. It is, I described it earlier to you as at first it was death metal for hardcore kids, and then when it became more popular, it was basically death metal for jocks. That's how I would describe it.
Both of those do not sound like, and I like death metal. Neither of those sound like death metal in the way that I would relate to. But also the whole thing that I like about nu metal when I finally came about with it, I would say is the musical weirdness, which I think is what people overlook when they criticize it. Yes. Like it wasn't that I was emotionally connecting with Fred Durst necessarily,
I mean, I do, Brian.
No shade to people that do. I know people do. But for me, it's the thing that like I had enough separation from nu metal that when I finally gave it a shot, I went like, oh, this is actually kind of strange. Musically, this is kind of hard to pin down, and people kind of overlook that. I am excited to listen to some deathcore for the pod, especially because then I can pair it with like an older hardcore album that kind of, we can do companion pieces like we're going to do with this episode.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so let's get into our final thoughts before we get into our pluggables. So real quick, this was my choice for this week. I fucking love this album. I think I heard about it for the first time maybe about a year or two ago, and when I listened to it, I'm like, holy shit, this was made in 1993, like just incredible. And yeah, for 15 minutes, very influential, very satisfying, and you're right, Brian, it is basically like one giant epic hardcore song in like one 15-minute EP. So yeah, highly recommended for anybody who enjoyed our previous albums that we've reviewed, and just in general, if you want to listen to fucking influential, fucking early 90s or just very influential hardcore and metalcore, would 100% recommend this EP here.
Yeah, I like this album. Again, I hadn't listened to it since high school. And actually, in high school, I don't think I liked it fine, but I didn't particularly like it because I was listening to weirder hardcore and kind of more 80s hardcore. I liked it a lot now listening to it. And I really liked tracing how influential it was to like what I know now looking backwards. I would recommend this album to anyone that likes hardcore with a very profound metal edge. So if you're really into like crossover, or if you're into later stuff, if you're into again, so if you're into Race Trader, hugely influenced by Earth Crisis. If you're into Leathermouth, if you're into any of those, but again, if you're into Shai Hulud, you will love Earth Crisis. Earth Crisis are, I would say, a little bit more directly influenced by like 80s hardcore punk, especially vocally. But if you're into like that shit, that late 90s, early 2000s metal hardcore hybrid stuff, or even if you're into like Corrosion of Conformity, you might be into this. I don't know. What I will say for myself is I've listened to 3 releases by Earth Crisis, and I re-listened to all of them this week. Of course, I listened to Firestorm many, many times because it's so short, and that's the one we're discussing. But for every 2 times that I listened to Firestorm, I listened to All Out War, the first EP by Earth Crisis. And I'm going to say something that Earth Crisis fans won't like. And I told you this, Taylor. I like All Out War significantly more on a personal level than Firestorm.
That was the one I didn't listen to. I listened to
So,
the first 2 full lengths and this.
so the thing with All Out War, so Firestorm is the more accomplished album. It is clearly the more masterful album. It is probably the album Earth Crisis are more proud of and that they feel really is when they refine their sound. That's true because I also listened to their first full length, Destroy the Machines, and you can definitely see that that sound comes together on Firestorm. But because that's not necessarily my favorite strand of hardcore, on All Out War, you can hear stronger traces of some of those weird influences. So there's more of those weird, high pitched, distorted guitar squeals, kind of like the pinch harmonics in Hidden Genocide. That's all over All Out War. There's this also much more prominent bass guitar. There's this very plucky kind of post punk bass. Again, kind of a lot of All Out War kind of reminds me of like a heavy Fugazi, which although it's messier, it's not as tight and it's not as conceptually realized as Firestorm. It did do more things that check off my boxes, but I would also say I can't imagine anyone liking one and not liking the other.
No, absolutely, yeah. And also, I was reading the Wikipedia article real quick. I did want to mention Andy Hurley was briefly in Earth Crisis too.
Yeah.
So like if you like Race Trader, if you love Andy Hurley, if you love Fall Out Boy, you have Earth Crisis to thank. Oh man. So, but yep, that is our review here. Let's get into our pluggables. So you can follow me at Carlos Chantor on twitter.com. And also you can follow us on both our YouTube and our Spotify page where we upload every episode simultaneously to both platforms. And as well, please donate to the Lucifer and the Father GoFundMe campaign. It's still going on. It's actually got quite a few more donations than it did like just a week or 2 ago as of recording this. So please donate. We really want to see a part 2 to this fantastic series made by our good friends, Scott, Sean, and Robert.
Yeah. Again, anyone who can demonstrate to me that they donated to Lucifer and the Father because they are a listener of the show, I will meet your donation within reason.
Yeah, within reason. Yes.
But that is a thing that I am willing to do. If a listener of our show will donate and then say, I donated this much and can show me that, I will meet your donation as long as you don't fucking try to fucking own me. Don't like mog on me.
It's not like 1,000. It's more like $10 to $20, right? Essentially.
Yeah. I think
you know what?
Really maybe
fair.
A little more than 20, but not much more than 20.
Maybe like 25.
So please follow the Millennials Are Old pod account on Instagram and follow the Millennials Are Old Facebook page. Those are the best ways to reach us. If you have a thing you want to suggest to me, if anyone listening finds some weird shit that a boomer or a Gen Xer or especially a millennial posted that you want to show us, I would say hit us there. You can also hit us up on one of our private accounts, but it would be best for me to organize it all if you sent it all to the Facebook page. That's also where I'm keeping my long list of people that I annoy.
Hell yeah. So with all those pluggables out of the way, Brian, I think it's time that we try to go to bed and hopefully not have a crisis by the fact that we're not able to fall asleep very easily because, there's a lot of information going around in our head all the time about the state of the earth, maybe. Okay, that was terrible.
Man, I just feel like, this is the first episode where I haven't been just furiously masturbating the whole time. And it's because
Oh,
of the influence of Earth Crisis. They've helped me have the self-control to not masturbate furiously
exactly, Brian.
during the record. So I am really not doing well right now. I'm in incredible pain.
Exactly, Brian. Just like Sheboygan, this fucking podcast is definitely a giant sausage factory. So,
Ain't that the
and you're
truth?
beating your sausage every time we record.
Not right now, but it's killing me. I don't know if I can do it again.
Yeah, you're getting those sperm cramps.
Luckily, our next episode will be about people who won't murder me for masturbating.
That is very true. With that ominous note out of the way, have a good night, everybody.